Everybody, today we are in Unit 5, Day 2, and today we're going to be talking about the causes of the Civil War and as we move in to the beginning of the Civil War. And you'll see that this is titled Two Societies at War, because really essentially, we're going to look at all the causes and every that, but really you do have two societies in this country at war. We've talked about in the early United States, the North and the South being two very different and distinct societies from the very beginning of colonization. And really, that is going to be seen through the Civil War and in the fighting of the Civil War, that you do have two very different parts of the country here at war. So that's why it's titled Two Societies at War. I have a short video here for you to watch, actually about 15 minutes. This is from CBS Sunday Morning. They did this on the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, talking about the causes of the Civil War and going through the specifics of it. So I encourage you to watch through this, listen for the causes that they mention, and listen to the different historical viewpoints that you are going to see throughout this video. Also, there's some songs there for you to examine as well. So causes of the Civil War. I like to boil down the causes of the Civil War to the three S's. I can't claim this as my own. I actually had a professor in college that used the three S's when talking about the Civil War. And I really liked it because it kind of incorporates all of the different many factors of the Civil War. Of course, when you hear the Civil War talked about, generally everybody, if they're going to boil it down to one cause, they say slavery, which that certainly is the big factor that does lead to the Civil War. When you're looking at these three S's, you're going to see that slavery really is intertwined in all of those things. But really, when you look at it, it boils down to the three S's here. So the first being sectionalism, the debate over tariffs. Again, this would be a constant battle going back to the nullification crisis between the North and the South hating tariffs, the North liking them. Also, you're going to have the defenders of slavery versus abolitionists. Again, you're going to have that small group of people in the South that really defend slavery and the small group of people in the South, the abolitionists, that are really very much against slavery. And also the ineffective leaders of the 1850s. We talked about the many one-term presidents during that time and how really they essentially didn't do anything to help out with the issues that were happening between the North and the South building up to the Civil War. So that's sectionalism. Again, idea that the North and the South very, very different. Of course, the big one being slavery. You have the Dred Scott case we had talked about. It happened in 1856, which again further divided the North and the South. Uncle Tom's Cabin as well. Another one of those things that showed the differences between the North and the South on views of slavery and failed slavery compromises. Again, we talked about compromise of 1850, Missouri Compromise, Kansas-Nebraska Act. All of those failed compromise over slavery that were really just band-aids on the problem of slavery. And then the last one being states' rights, the debate over the nature of the Union. The idea of, are we this loose gathering, loose confederation of states, or are we together as one and permanently that way? And then also you're going to see Lincoln's call for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion. Again, I mentioned that because you're going to see that the Upper South actually wasn't sold on secession from the Union until Lincoln did call for those troops. And then that's when you're going to see Virginia and other states leave during this time. So again, slavery is that big one that is intertwined with all of these. But as I've said with history before, it's easy to try to boil down a cause to something to one, but really you're going to see that there are a lot of factors that go into wars. And I think by boiling it down to one cause, it kind of does a disservice to the complicated nature of war and what war generally looks like. So yeah, slavery is the big cause, and it is part of these other things, but you do have other issues going in with this as well. Now, after the war, you will have the Lost Cause, which was propagated by Jubal Early, which was a group of Southerners that sought to say that the war was only about states' rights. I grew up in a house of that. That's where I was taught the war was only about states' rights. It wasn't about slavery. No, that's not true. The war was about slavery and states' rights and sectionalism. So again, after the war, there was a big push in the South to propagate that view of the war only being about states' rights, which in reality is not true at all. All right, so the effect of Lincoln's election, we left off last time with Lincoln's election, and Southerners believed that the Republican victory was a clear and immediate danger to South in slavery. Remember, Republicans had started as the anti-slavery party. Lincoln, though, promised that he would not mess with slavery in the South, again, that he just didn't want to extend it. He promises that, but Southerners did not believe him. Lincoln states his desire, again, to keep the country united and together. So again, remember, Lincoln's not going to be inaugurated until early in 1861, but in late 1860, you start to see that the pieces come together for Southern secession. December 20th, 1860, you'd have South Carolina calling a special state convention, and in that convention, they would vote unanimously to secede from the Union. And then January and February, you're going to have the rest of the lower South all vote to secede from the Union. In February, you'd have the creation of the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, who has served many roles within the U.S. government, including being a senator, being the Secretary of War, etc., he would be named president, and Alexander Hamilton Stevens would be named vice president of the Confederacy. And the initial capital of the Confederacy would be in Mississippi there. So what about the Upper South? You're going to see that secessionist feelings were less intense in areas with fewer slaves. Now, Virginia did have a lot of slaves, but you're going to see Virginia is very torn on this issue of secession. In the later name, what would be known as the border states, yeoman farmers had a lot of political power there and did not support the war. And generally, again, this is among that dividing line of people that had slaves and people that did not have slaves. So, compromise. So as it's very apparent that we're going on this trajectory, the South is seceding, that could possibly lead to war. You would have Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, who would propose the following. He would say, let's put a constitutional amendment in place to protect slavery where it already is and expand the Missouri Compromise line to the California border. Republicans would be against this plan on orders from Lincoln. Lincoln feared that if the South was given this protection of slavery, that maybe the South might attempt to spread slavery into Latin America and into the Caribbean. So he had fears over that. So he rejects this idea of trying to do that. And you're going to see at this point that the South wasn't really having it. They were feeling like that the best course of action for them would be to have their own country. So March of 1861, Lincoln is inaugurated. He does promise again to safeguard slavery in the South, but says that new territories must be free. He states his view that secession is illegal and acts of violence in support of secession would be considered insurrection. So you might be wondering, what was happening in the time period between Lincoln's election and inauguration? Well, you have President James Buchanan in there who basically does nothing. He doesn't do anything to try to keep the South in. And yeah, again, weak leader doesn't really try to do anything about this. That leads us to Fort Sumter. One of the first things that Lincoln would do is dispatch a relief expedition to Fort Sumter, assuring the Confederate States of America that it was going to be a peaceful mission and that basically he wanted to send people there to get the people out of Fort Sumter. They do decide to stay there and, again, to resupply them. Now, some believe that Davis might have wanted a military confrontation to get support from the upper border states and that he demands the surrender of the fort. I know that there are other people that view it that Lincoln wanted a military confrontation so that Lincoln could get the whole support of the North in using the military against the South. Because again, at this time, nobody is using the military yet. Things are still very kind of cordial between the North and the South. So again, depending on how you view history and how you view, if you look at the letters written during this time from the people in South Carolina at the forts and that kind of thing, again, widely affects and influences your views over what would happen at Fort Sumter. Major Anderson would refuse to surrender there, and therefore Confederate forces would fire on the fort. You're going to see this wild dude who is pictured right up here, Edmund Ruffin. He would be widely credited with firing the first shot of the Civil War there at Fort Sumter. A lot of people say he fired the first and the last shot of the Civil War because after the Civil War, he would actually commit suicide, saying that he could not bear to live under the Yankee rule. So that's Fort Sumter. So now that shots have been fired, war is on. You are going to see at Fort Sumter that there are no deaths. The Union troops that are there do decide to evacuate the fort. And in fact, the only person that died would be at the end in the final shots. Actually, the shots when surrendering the fort, there would be a malfunction and someone would die with that. And you can see the picture there of the first national flag of the Confederacy flying over Fort Sumter. So you are going to see during the war, I've talked about before these points in history where you're going to see a growth of executive power, and the Civil War is going to be one of those. Lincoln would act in very unprecedented ways, expanding his power as president and as commander-in-chief. Often he would act without authorization or approval of Congress, leading to a lot of criticism from Democrats during this time. You're going to see, again, Lincoln does a lot of things that makes Democrats very angry, and some of it makes his own party very angry because he would expand his own power. You will see criticism over that. Some people trying to say that he's acting like a Caesar. I've actually heard some people refer to and call him America's Caesar based on his actions during the war. After Fort Sumter, Lincoln would call for 75,000 troops to put down the rebellion in the Cotton States. He would authorize the spending for war, and the biggie that he does is suspend habeas corpus. Now, in suspending habeas corpus is Latin for you have the body, and basically habeas corpus prevents government officials from holding someone indefinitely without charges. So if you've ever watched like a show that deals with like police and that kind of thing, I think of like Law and Order. They always mention in that like, hey, we have 24, 48 hours to charge this poor person of a crime, or we have to let them go. So Lincoln suspended this, and the reason that he suspended this is that both Maryland and Washington, D.C. were full of pro-Confederate sentiment. And this was especially true in Maryland, where there was belief that the state legislature there, if they would have a vote for secession, that they would probably vote to secede from the Union. So Lincoln decided to suspend habeas corpus to arrest a lot of these people that were against the United States during this time, including many of those in the Maryland legislature. Now, later on, the Supreme Court would find this unconstitutional. Shades of Andrew Jackson here. Lincoln would continue the suspension of habeas corpus, even though the Supreme Court found that unconstitutional. Now, Lincoln would use his own reasoning behind why he would do this, but he thought it was in the best interest of the country for him to suspend habeas corpus. Now, in calling for these volunteers, like I said, he called them to put down the rebellion in the Cotton States, as he called it. A lot of Northerners respond to this very enthusiastic. But it leaves the Southerners in the Upper South with the question of what do they do now? And in the border, what would become the border states as well. Virginia and Kentucky would be considered very vital to the war effort, also Maryland as well. And you're going to see now it's left up to these states to decide what they are going to do. Right here, this is from the Virginia governor at that time. He would be Virginia's Civil War governor, Governor Letcher. He would reply to Lincoln and to the Secretary of War's request for troops with this response in April 6 of 1861. He said, "I have only to say that the militia of Virginia will not be furnished to the powers at Washington for any such use or purpose as long as they have in view. Your object is to subjugate the Southern states, and a requisition made upon me for such an object in my judgment not within the purview of the Constitution, will not be complied with. You have chosen to inaugurate civil war, and having done so, we will meet it in a spirit as determined as the administration has exhibited towards the South." So you can see that is a very strong statement from the governor of Virginia saying, look, we're not going to send troops. We don't agree with you sending troops into your own country, and yet you have chosen to inaugurate the Civil War that is about to happen. So you're going to see that there would be 3 votes of an ordinance of secession here in Virginia. If you look at the votes there, the first vote in April 4th, 1861, you're going to see that there are a lot of pro-union votes in the country, in the county, or in the state, especially in those counties that you did not see a large number of slavery. So like what would become West Virginia, the mountains here of Virginia, again, places that you don't see a large number of slaves in that area. The first vote was delayed, second vote failed, and then the third vote would be successful. And again, the reason you're going to see that big change here in Virginia is because by this point, Fort Sumter had happened and Lincoln's call for troops had happened. Now, again, this changes a lot of people's views on the war and which exactly should be done about joining the Confederacy. Again, a lot of Virginians didn't necessarily want to leave the Union, but when they saw what Lincoln was doing, how he was firing on or what happened at Fort Sumter and the calling of troops, a lot of Virginians were not behind that, and that is why you're going to see such a drastic change in the votes here. Is again, a lot of people didn't like that idea of sending troops into the South. So the Upper South would decide in response to Lincoln's call for troops. A Virginia convention, as we just saw, did approve secession. The North was the aggressor, and the South resisted her invaders. And that's how you're going to see a lot of people in the South view the Civil War that weren't slave owners. They felt like that they were defending their state against an invading army. With this, that you are going to see that Robert E. Lee was offered the Union command, and he would refuse that. If you click on that, that's a video from the movie Gods and Generals, where he explains his reasoning behind that. And with Virginia seceding, you're also going to see North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas all decide to leave the Union as well. And you can see the states there in the lighter blue are going to be the border states that do not secede and are very torn in their alliances between the North and the South, which is why they ultimately end up being considered border states. And again, with going back to Robert E. Lee, he was somebody that did own slaves, but he personally felt like secession was wrong and didn't agree with secession. And he actually was quite torn on this decision of what to do after being offered the command of the Union Army. He ultimately turns it down and decides to side with Virginia. And he wrote extensively at this point about how he could not go against his native Virginia, and that is why he sided with Virginia. So Lincoln would maneuver. Lincoln maneuvers to hold the border states. In May of 1861, General McClellan ordered to take control of Northwest Virginia to secure railway lines, and you're going to see that is when West Virginia is formed. In Maryland, like I already said, you're going to see very strong Confederate feelings there, which led to many protests and riots. Lincoln would actually respond by ordering the military occupation of Maryland and of the arrest of Confederate sympathizers. And this just applied not only to people that were Confederate sympathizers, but even people that wrote in the newspaper and who maybe weren't as big fans of Lincoln and some of the unconstitutional things he were doing. A famous example would be Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. His grandson would actually be locked up during this time. He was a newspaper editor within Baltimore and wrote against Lincoln because he didn't agree with Lincoln's some of his unconstitutional actions. And he would be in prison at Fort McHenry, which is where Francis Scott Key, again, was looking at the flag when he wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. You would see that the German-American militia would be used to help retain Missouri, and Lincoln would be very, very cautious in Kentucky, where Unionists eventually take control. But in these border states, you're going to see this is a common theme throughout the war. Lincoln has to be very, very careful with them because he doesn't want them to eventually decide to leave the Union. So what would be the war objectives and strategies? Jefferson Davis states that the Southerners are fighting against tyranny and for the sacred right of self-government. And you're going to see that a lot of times in the writings from this, you're going to see that Southerners and Confederates compare themselves and what they were fighting for to the patriots of old. And they earnestly believed that if George Washington was still alive, that he would be on the side of the South. I put on here a seal of the Confederate States there, and you'll actually see that in the middle of their seal is George Washington. Davis states, look, the Confederacy, we don't want to expand. We just want to be left alone. And the ideal end goal for the Confederacy would be securing a stalemate, and that maybe the North would get tired of the war and that the South would just be allowed to exist as its own country. Now, Lincoln portrays secession as an attack on popular government. His goal was very clear that he wanted to keep the Union together. He wanted to use an aggressive military strategy and said, look, there has to be unconditional surrender. We are not going to settle with there being two different countries. We want to be united as one country. So that leads us to the first major battle of the Civil War, which would be the Battle of Manassas, which is known as Bull Run in the North. You're going to see the North and the South disagreed on pretty much everything, including the naming of battles. Generally, the South named battles after the closest town, whereas the North named battles after the closest geographical feature. So in Manassas, you have Bull Run Creek. As far as the National Park Service and most historians are concerned, they go with the naming of the battle of the side that won at that. So Manassas, again, the South is going to win this battle. So Lincoln hopes to quickly take Richmond and sends troops into Virginia. 30 miles outside of D.C., at Manassas Junction, again, you have a lot of train tracks and stuff in that area. Union troops would encounter Confederate troops for the first time. And like I said, you're going to have this first major battle. You'd actually have many civilians who would come from Washington, D.C. to observe the battle from a distance away, but they were coming to observe it because a lot of people believed that this war would be over quickly, that there would be one major battle, the Confederates would be routed, and the battle would be over. The important thing to remember, though, is that you have very green troops on each side, which means they're unexperienced on both sides. You put that together, and basically, it's going to be a lot of chaos at this first battle. So during this battle, you're going to see Union soldiers would hear what becomes known as the rebel yell for the first time. They included a link there. After the war, they actually went back and tried to get some veterans and capture what the rebel yell sound like, because that's something that Union soldiers write about, how throughout the whole war, how they hated the sound of the rebel yell because they knew what was coming after that. Also famously during this battle, Thomas Jackson would earn the nickname Stonewall when rallying the Virginia troops. And a commander would look and say, look at the Virginians, look at Jackson's there standing like a stone wall. And that's where he would get the nickname. And again, he would be very important to the Confederate war effort up into his death. Now with this battle went very back and forth, and a lot of people credit that stand of the Virginians and Stonewall Jackson with helping lead to Confederate victory during this. The Union Army would be defeated and would retreat back to Washington, D.C. Now, the Confederate Army actually could have pursued them, but the Confederate Army was in a lot of disarray after this battle as well, because again, they had a very green army as well. In response to this, Lincoln is going to fire General McDowell and replace him with General McClellan. This is going to be a common trend of the Civil War, is that Lincoln had a really tough time finding a good Union general during the war, and he's going to constantly be rotating through generals. So one of the things you're going to be doing today is creating a timeline of the Civil War, some of the major events of the Civil War, and some of the major battles of this. So make sure you take a look at that. But today we are ending with the Battle of Manassas. Next class, we're going to jump in and talk about, kind of go through the war in its entirety and what the war looked like. And again, the reason that I'm so passionate about this is because, again, it really, really interests me. But when you are looking at American history, really, it was building to the Civil War. And really, since the Civil War, we've been dealing with the aftermath of the Civil War. If you look at 2020 and some of the racial issues that we have had, a lot of this is stuff going back to the beginning of our country and going back to the Civil War. So this really is the pivotal moment in our history. And you're going to see that it's going to change the future trajectory of our country and what we look like as a country. So again, next class, we'll be jumping into the war. Today, you need to do that timeline. So hope you have a good one.